All right, we're going to continue where we left off last week with reference to Matthew 24 and some of the language that's found in that chapter. And just by way of just a quick review, looking at Matthew 24 verses 33 and 34, where Jesus makes kind of a summary statement, says, "When you see, even at the door, this generation will not pass till all these things take place or be fulfilled or come to pass." And these things in 33 and these things in 34 refer to all of the signs that are mentioned in verses 5 through 31. And in particular, 5 through 28. Because we're going to talk a little bit tonight about 29, 30, and 31. But the point of the matter, the most important thing to remember about this text is it summarizes the time frame of when these events will take place. It says, you will see all these things. This generation will not pass till all these things take place. And we talked about the famines and pestilences and earthquakes and wars and rumors of wars. And all of those things transpired during that historical period of time. We noted also in particular that Matthew 24:14 says that the gospel will be preached all around the world, and then the end will come. In other words, all these signs will take place, and included in that is the preaching of the gospel to every single person on the planet. Now, as I was doing my research for this, I was reading in Adam Clarke's commentary, and Clarke is a very conservative commentator, Methodist, I believe from the 18th century. Old Testament stuff is really, really good. But I was reading, I wanted to see what Clarke had to say about these two verses. And he tried to make this generation apply to all of the Jewish people. And in his explanation, he said, the gospel hadn't been preached, and he noted this verse. He said, the gospel hadn't been preached to everybody yet, and there's still Jews walking around on the earth, and so these things have not happened yet. I thought that was interesting because, and I even said it out loud as I was reading his commentary. Said, he missed it. He missed it. Because Colossians 1:6, Colossians 1:23, Romans 10:16-18 is very clear. The gospel was preached to every creature under heaven. I mean, the Bible couldn't be any more clear on that fact. The gospel was preached to the whole world in the first generation. And by the way, and note also that within one generation of the life and death of Christ, the gospel was preached to the entire world. The entire world. And so Clarke missed it. The gospel was preached, and that's part of those signs. And when the gospel was preached worldwide, the end did indeed come. And so you have, when you see all these things, referring back, then, and this generation will not pass. We noted also in the late 60s or early 70s, might have been about 1970. I should look the copyright date on it. Hal Lindsey wrote his book, The Late Great Planet Earth. And it sold tens of millions of copies. And Lindsey was at that time, I think, a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary, a Baptist seminary, and extremely premillennial in its theology. And Lindsey said, from the establishment of Israel in 1948, that a generation would be about 40 years, and Lindsey predicted that the rapture would take place somewhere near or about 1988. Well, then he started backpedaling. In 1977, he said, well, maybe generation doesn't mean what we've always thought it meant, and he extended the idea of a generation out to perhaps as many as 100 years, which would make sure that he was dead by the time that prophecy didn't come true. So it's always convenient to predict things that'll happen after you're dead, as opposed to when you're still alive. And so it was in 1977 when he started crawfishing on his 1988 prediction. And I guess because some of the signs weren't coming true that maybe he thought. Of course, you have to remember, in 1967, you'd had the 6 Days War, Egypt and Israel. And there was a lot of turmoil in Egypt and Israel and the Middle East at that time with actual wars going on. And then that's when this speculation just started running wild. That's when a lot of this stuff, this idea of we're in the end times right now began to manifest itself. And of course, 1988 came and went, and nothing happened. And the year 2000 came and went, and nothing happened. And so, but the mistakes that have been taught in regard to this text are almost too numerous to mention. And then we concluded by noting the phrase, this generation. What did Jesus mean when he said, this generation? And we looked at the 5 times in the book of Matthew where he quoted Jesus saying, this generation. And in Matthew 11, 16 to 19, he said that there would, like the men of, or in Matthew 12, 41, 45, 3 times, like the men of Sodom will rise up with this generation and condemn it. So-and-so will rise up with this generation and condemn it. Matthew 11, Jesus said, he said, we've piped to you and you've not danced, and we've mourned and you've not mourned. And he talked about this generation. He was talking about Jews living right then. Matthew 12, 3 times, he's talking about Jews living right then. And then in the immediate context of Matthew 23, 29 to 36, when he said this generation, he was talking about Jews living right then. But somehow when we get to this generation, in the very next chapter, it means something 2,000 years down the road. So that's just bad. That's bad exegesis. And it's very, very inconsistent. So this generation is found 5 times in Matthew's account other than in this text. But even if we didn't have these, this would still be sufficient. Now what I want you to do now is turn to Matthew 24, and we're going to look at verses 29 through 31. Because there's some language used in that text. And while I'm erasing this, Derek, are you turning there, brother?
I can be there in half a second.
All right, you get there. And when you get there, I want you to read. And I'm calling on you, number 1, because I know people can hear you. And number 2, you and I discussed this at some length after services last.
You talking about Matthew or one of the other chapters?
I want you to look at Matthew 24. I want you to look at Matthew 24, 29 through 31. Read that for me, brother.
Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fail from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other.
All right, now when we listen to that type of language being used, the initial response to that is, that's got to be talking about the end of the world.
Even the headers, that was another thing I didn't think that I had seen. Even the headers in, the man-made headers in Scripture, the written Bible, have misleading headers.
Right, and that's another thing. You cannot trust.
Yeah, you can't, but I...
Well, I marked mine out.
You marked your header out? I see it, big black mark right there.
Well, the head
digitally, I can't quite do that.
Yeah, you can't do that on the digital version, can you?
Coming of the Son of Man. But I don't think that's it.
All right, so, but we hear that kind of language. All right? The sun's darkened, the moon doesn't give its light, stars falling, and the elect will be gathered from the 4 corners of the earth. The messengers will be sent, and the elect will be gathered. Now, the language that is found in these 3 verses cannot be wrenched out of its context. All right?
It so easily is. People yank those 3 verses right out, and it's, you know.
All right, verses 5 through 28 are the signs to be watched for. Signs to watch. All right? Then you have verses 29 through 31, and we're going to put a question mark right here. But here's our problem. I say not our problem, it's their problem. All right? And their problem is this. We just studied these verses, right? Verse 33 and verse 34. And those verses say what?
That particular generation right there.
You will see these things. This generation, again, this generation will not pass. And so, how is it? And of course, by the way, people that believe, as a general rule, verses 29 through 31 refer to the end of the world, also say that this also refers to the end of the world. But they still can't get around verses 33 and 34, which are very explicit in who the audience is and what the audience is to look for in regard to the second coming. Now, I want to note, back in the previous context, or in the immediate context, in Matthew 24, look at verse number 15. Now, I'm going to read this with you, and I want you to listen, or read along with me if you can, and listen to the language, and tell me if verses 5 through 28 sound like the end of the world. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. Let him who is in the field not go back and get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight, that is your escape, is not on the winter or in the winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been seen from the beginning until this time, nor will there ever be. Let me ask you a question. If these passages, what verse I read? Verses 15 through, where did I stop? 21. Where are you going to run at the end of the world?
Why does it matter if you're pregnant or not?
Sir?
So why does it matter if you're pregnant or not? You can look at all of them that way.
That's what I'm saying. What difference does it make if you're nursing a baby or pregnant or you're in the field? Or what difference does it make? If this is the end of the world, where are you going to run? You see how silly it is to apply these types of things to the end of the world? And now wait a minute. And I'm going to go even a step further. Then they say, well, it refers kind of to the end of the world, but it's also talking about the rapture and the tribulation right before the end of the world, or right before the 1,000-year reign, etc. But again, I ask the question, why would Jesus warn people to run if they were going to be raptured and miss all of that? See, the very idea of the rapture is that it allows Christians to miss the tribulation. So if you're a Christian and you're faithful, why do you have to run if God's going to snatch you up?
Why would you need to go back home and get clothes?
and why would you be worried about going home to get clothes?
Verse there you can apply that thinking.
Yeah, I mean, one passage after another, there's no way to get a rapture out of this. Just given the nature of the warning and what it's for and what a person is, if you're going to be raptured, it doesn't matter anyway. You're going to miss it because you're going to get snatched up. And by the way, there's no warnings to get raptured. Right? I mean, they say there's going to be signs, but when you get raptured, nobody's going to say, well, it's going to happen at 6:30 tomorrow night. And then everybody just disappears. It's just going to snatch them up in the blink of an eye. Well, then why is Jesus talking about watching for signs and running to the hills and not going home hope you don't have a baby or try to travel on the Sabbath or all? What difference does it make? You see how foolish this whole concept is in light of the very passages that they purport to teach it. All right, so we've already looked at this. Why run? And where are you going to go? All right, now we go down to verses 29 to 31. This has obviously got to be signs to something other than the end of, the end of the world. And this is obviously a reference to something other than the end of the world because of the language. See these things, this generation will not pass. All right? So, how is it then that one might be able to just rip these three verses and somehow apply them to the end? Just because it sounds like the end of the world, right? It sounds like the end of the world. Now, here's what we're going to pick up with some Old Testament. Some of you look in Isaiah 13 and verse 10. Isaiah 13 and verse 10. Somebody look at Isaiah 34 and verse 3. Somebody look at Ezekiel 32, verses 1 and 2. All right, we'll start in Isaiah 13 and verse number 10. All right? Now, I'm going to go ahead and write this. I'm going to write language sounds like the end. Okay? So we all understand when I write that, correct? Language sounds like the end. All right? Now, since we're working on our notebooks, Isaiah 13 and verse 10. Somebody read that for me, please.
For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine.
The stars, the sun, and the moon are all going to disappear. They're not going to shine. They're not going to give their light. That sounds like the end of the world, doesn't it? All right? Now, herein lies our problem. Kim, please now read to me verse 1 of that chapter.
The burden against Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz saw, lift up a banner on the high mountain. Raise your voice to them. Wave your hand. Oh, well, no.
That's all right. That's good enough. Who's he writing to? Verse 1. Writing to Babylon. Prophesying against Babylon. And uses the same kind of language about the sun and the moon and the stars in Isaiah 13:10. And we know that he's talking about Babylon from verse number 1. All right, now, somebody give me Isaiah 34, 3 and 4. Yeah, I know. Everybody turned to Isaiah 13. When I said it, nobody turned to 34.
No,
I know how y'all are.
But you didn't need me to read it. Go. Also, their slain shall be thrown out. Their stink shall rise from their corpses, and the mountain shall be melted with their blood. All the hosts of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll, and their hosts shall fall down, as a leaf falls from the vine, and as fruit falling from a fig tree.
All right.
It was picking fruit there is what's going on, right?
Yeah. The mountains be melted with their blood. The host of heaven will be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll, and all the host of heaven shall fall down. Now, who's this writing about? Look at the end of verse 6. This is one of those times when remember I threw out some potential nations last week. My memory served me correctly. I got them all. I got all of them. Isaiah 3, 34, 3 and 4. And then verse 6. Do we find a nation mentioned there? Edom. A proclamation against Edom. By the way, Moses spoke of this in Deuteronomy chapter 23 when the Edomites turned back Israel when they wanted to pass through their land, coming into the land of promise. The Edomites, the Idumeans or Edomia, they are the descendants of Esau. The descendants of Esau. But yet, what the host of heaven dissolved and the sky rolled back as a scroll. That sounds like the end of the world, doesn't it? And yet, it's a proclamation against Edom. Now, somebody give me Ezekiel 32.
What verses you mean?
1 and 2 and 6 through 8.
And it came to pass in the 12th year and the 12th month, on the first day of the month, that the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation for Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and say to him, You are like a young lion among the nations, and you are like a monster in the seas, bursting forth in your rivers, troubling the waters with your feet, and fouling your rivers. When you say 6, what?
Now, all right, so who's he writing to?
Egypt, Pharaoh.
Egypt. Now, describe it for me, beginning in verse 6.
I will also water the land with the flow of your blood, even to the mountains, and the riverbeds will be full of you.
All right, keep reading. All the way to verse 8.
When I put out your light, I will cover the heavens and make its stars dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give her light. All the bright lights of the heavens I will make dark over you and bring darkness upon your land, says the Lord your God.
There you go. That sounds just like what we read in Matthew 24, doesn't it? And yet he's writing in that case to Egypt. Take up a lamentation. Take up a proclamation against Pharaoh. All right? Now there's one more. And we don't have time to read it, but I want you to write it down on your note.
Is that Joel?
That's Joel.
See, I like that one better.
Joel's better than all of them, but it's just such a long read that we don't have time for it.
And Ezekiel number 2, and then Isaiah.
Yeah.
It was all so
Joel, of all the passages, Joel, and by the way, we can begin this in Joel 2:28 through 3:15. Joel 2:28 through 3:15. Now, Joel 2:28 to 32 is what Peter quoted on the day of Pentecost. But do you remember some of the things that Peter said on the day of Pentecost in connection to the preaching of the gospel, and some things that would be connected to the preaching of the gospel? I will show wonders in the heavens above and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord. That sounds just like what we read in Matthew 24:39. All right? And if you read the context, it's about verse 6 in Joel 3. And this is involved in a prophecy using the phraseology of Tyre and Sidon. So now, we have 4 Old Testament prophecies that use language that's almost identical to Matthew 24:29 to 31. So the conclusion is this, and the only reasonable conclusion is this. Jesus is using language right here that described judgment on 4 nations. In other words, that type of language was used when those 4 nations were going to be utterly destroyed by God. So then, when Jesus uses this type of language in Matthew 24, in the Jews' mind, what are they going to associate that with?
Destruction of a nation.
Destruction of a nation. And Jesus said, and the nation that's going to be destroyed is you. It's you. These things are going to happen to you. They're not going to happen to Rome. This is not a prophecy against Rome. This is not a prophecy against anything. This is a prophecy against you. These things will come on this generation. And so he was using language that every single Jew would have been familiar with. Because they had heard it twice in Isaiah, they'd heard it in Ezekiel, they'd heard it in Joel, and now they're hearing it being applied to them. And the context is the destruction or God's judgment upon the nations. And in AD 70, God rendered his judgment, final judgment on Israel. He wiped them out.
And that was about 37 years later.
37 years.
Which is a 40-year generation. Which is
Yeah. I mean, Jesus lived. Jesus' ministry. Jesus' ministry.
Is that not one of the reasons that the Jews can't find their ancestry?
That's exactly right.
That's what I thought.
30 to 33. Jesus said, the Bible says Jesus was about 30 years old. Okay? So that doesn't mean he was 30 years old, but somewhere around about 30, he began his public ministry. And by piecing all the narratives together, we can know, based on that and some of the historical accounts, like Pilate and others, and Tiberius and the Caesars and whatnot, that his reign, or his earthly ministry was about 2.5, 3.5 years. All right? And then he says, this generation, all right, 40 years from there would be sometime right around AD 70. And Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. I mean, there's just no getting around that. There's just no way to get around it.
Unless you just choose not to accept not only the biblical context and the biblical narrative. You got to reject the history, the secular history. In other words, everything that we know of in secular history also concords with what we're teaching that the Bible says in this case. And so Matthew 24, 29 to 31 cannot be the end of the world, because everything before it is the destruction of Jerusalem. That which is immediately after it is the destruction of Jerusalem. You can't just rip those 3 verses out of that context and apply them to some time more than now 2,000 years down the road. I said more than 2,000, nearly 2,000 years down the road. You see how problematic that is? We don't just get to rip verses out. Oh, and by the way, let me give you one more thing that I wrote on my book and didn't write it and didn't give it to you. Look at this word at the beginning of verse 29. Immediately.
In those days.
Say it again, Walter.
It says immediately in those days.
Immediately in those days. Well, what days is he talking about? The ones he just finished describing in verses 5 through 28. Immediately in those days, this is going to take place. Matthew 24, 29 to 31. And unless there be any discussion or dispute about when that is, this generation. Immediately in or after those days.
In verse 23, he said, don't believe this stuff.
Yeah, about Christ is here, and Christ is here, and Christ is there.
It's going to say this, all this kind of stuff, that you don't believe it.
Right, and the thing is, That was applied to people back then, but it's still even that idea would even apply to us. Is the don't let if somebody's really that far off on something that's this easy, then you might want to check them on something else, everything else they're teaching as well.
Scary.
Yeah, it is. All right. Any questions? Any questions about this? All right. One more thing. Back to the text, Matthew 24. I want to deal with the last part because some people say, well, what does it mean that he'll send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they'll gather together his elect from the four winds and from one end to the other? One thing that has to be remembered. I don't know where I'm going to write this. I guess I'll draw a line under here and draw it here. What about the angels? And what about the gathering of the elect? Perfectly legitimate questions. This is from verse 31. What about the angels? And what about the gathering of the elect? That sounds like judgment, right? I mean, that sounds like the end of the world. All right? In Revelation chapters 2 and 3, Jesus gives instruction to the churches, right? The 7 churches of Asia. For example, somebody look in Revelation chapter 2 and about verse 2 or 3.
Well, some of them won't quit doing everything they're doing here just a period of time because they taught them. But they get on to them about that.
That's right. All right. Look in Revelation 2 and where the red letters start. All right. Read me the first line that's in red letters. In Revelation 2.
To the angel of the church of Ephesus, right?
Good enough. Right there. To the angel of the church at Ephesus, right. All right. Now, when we get to the next church, what does it say about that church? What's the opening line?
The angel of the church of Smyrna.
Angel of the church at Smyrna. All right, guess what? That's how they all open.
Yeah.
To the angel of the church here, to the angel of the church there, to the angel of the church there. Let me ask you a question. Is that a heavenly angel?
I don't think it is.
It can't be.
No.
It can't be a heavenly angel. Why?
Angels don't know when the end of time or nothing else is coming.
The angels, first of all, the angels aren't preaching to the churches. Whose job was it to preach to the church? The Christian's job. You know, the gospel was committed into the hands of men who were to preach the gospel to all the world and also preach it within the confines of the church. There were no angels preaching. Also, even if it was an angel preaching, why would they need John to write them to tell them what to preach? I mean, find me an angel in the Old Testament who came and talked to men but got his message from another man. Every angel that showed himself on the earth came with a message directly from God and not a message written by a man to give to the angel. You see what I'm saying? The word angel just simply means messenger. Just means messenger. All right? So on your note here, an angel is simply a messenger. And the word angel does not necessarily imply a spirit being from heaven. So, to the angel of the church at Ephesus, that was the preacher at the church at Ephesus. To the angel of the church at Smyrna, that was the preacher at the church at Smyrna. He was the one receiving the message to give to the people. So the word angel just simply means messenger. And the context has to determine whether or not it's a spirit being or simply a messenger. All right? Well, then what about the gathering of the elect? What about the gathering of the elect?
Well, if we study in the Bible, you're going to be gathered up into the air.
Well, that
at the end of time.
but that is true, but this is not the end of time.
Yeah, I know it.
But that's why it sounds like the end of time and why people want to make a mistake with it. Consider this. And Kim will appreciate this. I was talking about Josephus. I remember when I was talking about Josephus, I could just see, I could tell she'd been reading Josephus. Even Josephus records that when Jerusalem was destroyed, that not one Christian died. Not one Christian died in the destruction of Jerusalem. Why?
Well, they done what he said to do.
Because they did what he said to do. And so when these signs began to appear right before the destruction of Jerusalem, God's messengers began to preach, these are the signs that the Lord warned us about when he was here. It's time to get going. And thus, all the Christians escaped Jerusalem before its destruction because they saw the signs that Jesus promised them. So then, the messengers preached the message, and the elect were gathered out of Jerusalem and away from the destruction that the Romans were bringing to the world, or to Jerusalem, and particularly in Judea. But God's people were spared because of the words of the messengers. The words of the messengers.
I guess you might ought to say God's believing people.
Yeah, God's believing people. And by the way, Hebrews 10:25. All right? You might add this in here. Hebrews 10:25. Forsaking not the assembling of yourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. Now, that is an admonition not to forsake the assembly. I mean, it's clear. Don't forsake the assembly. But the purpose of it was, the purpose of not forsaking the assembly was to be present, to be exhorted and encouraged to faithfulness, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. The day approaching. That's why it was so important for Christians to remain faithful in the first 40 years of the life of the church. Because a Christian who got away from the church and drifted into unfaithfulness not only could die in that condition as being unfaithful, but they might drift away shortly before these signs and become so spiritual, become in such a spiritual stupor that they didn't see the signs, didn't recognize the signs, and in so doing got caught up in the destruction of Jerusalem. That's what Walt said. God's faithful people. And there's a connection even for us today. It's not by extension. How many unfaithful Christians think about their souls? How many unfaithful Christians think about the end of time? How many faithful Christians think about the judgment? How many unfaithful Christians think about hell? How many Christians that forsake the assembly consistently think about these things with any degree of sobriety or with any degree of consistency? What's going to happen to them? They won't be ready. If the Lord comes, they won't be ready. And if death snatches them into eternity, they still won't be ready. That's why being faithful to the church is so important. It reminds you that you're living for something and you're looking for something. Now, in this time, they were watching for the destruction of Jerusalem. In our time, we're watching for the destruction of the world, the end of the world, and to be ready at any time that it might come. Does that make sense?
Yes, to me.
That's why we want to be faithful to the assemblies. Because we're exhorted when we come to the assemblies. We learn about the Word of God. We're encouraged to live lives of righteousness and holiness and faithfulness, so that should death snatch us away in a moment's time, or should the Lord come, we'll be ready. we'll be ready.
Well, I always wondered, what are they gonna answer if they haven't been faithful to come when they could have?
Yeah, what are you
Now, I'm
gonna
not
say?
saying if you're
Well,
sick or anything.
You know, when the man tried to come into the wedding feast without a wedding garment, the king said, "How did you get in here without a wedding garment?" And the Bible says the man was speechless. He was speechless. In other words, there was no answer. Didn't have anything to say. And so that, you know, that's something that's
Well, Bible will teach you, you're gonna have to give an answer.
going to have to give an answer.
And right there, you're gonna have to give an answer.
That's right. Every man will give an account of himself before God. Romans 14:12. Any questions? All right. I didn't intend to spend this much time on this, but I did. Next week is meat eating meat with fruit baskets. The following week is singing night. And the following week,
Wait a minute, got one thing. They announced this morning, or you did, or somebody, that it was gonna have a class, those classes about the singing and stuff next week,
no, yeah,
but we're not.
no, it'll be 2 weeks. It'll be the 18th. Yeah, it'll be the 18th and not the 11th. And then the 18th will be singing night. And then the next one is Christmas. So we're going to get to come back to this after Christmas. And we're going to do a Luke 17, verses 31 to 37, and Matthew 24, 37 to 41 on left behind. We're going to talk about getting left behind. The two texts, the two well-known texts. So we're going to be away from this for a few weeks with all the other things we've got going on, but we'll come back to this and we'll close up, try to close up this section on the rapture before we move into the tribulation. So, this has been a good study, and I think we're doing a thorough job of getting into the scriptures, and that's what we want. You know, we're getting our notebooks put together. We want a good resource, and we want to put this knowledge in our minds and in our hearts. All right, any questions? All right, if not,